Welcome back to the PCA breakdown of the 2026 Spring UIL topic. Today we're switching sides. We're going to start with the negative side of things, starting with looking at the development neg. So the negative also usually has the advantage of LD as kind of being more of the realist in the room, right? So the affirmative usually paints a picture of a connected, prosperous world, whereas the negative kind of argues that for a developing country, jumping into the deep end of globalization without the life jacket first of protectionism is kind of an economic suicide mission. So let's start with the framework of things. So we start with the standard definition that we've had here of developing countries and protectionism. Notice our definition of globalization is from the Oxford English Dictionary that argues that globalization is widely considered to be at the expense of national identity, right? So it kind of sets a subtle narrative that globalization isn't just trade; it's a force that could swallow a nation's independence itself. So let's get into the value and the criterion here. So um, we start with the generic value of morality, and then we get into the criterion of consequentialism. So, using the Harris evidence, we argue that moral claims are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. If globalization causes suffering, poverty, or debt in the real world, then the affirmative's moral, obligation kind of fails. So, the utility for this is that if the framework forces the judge to look at these results, if you're telling the judge don't vote for the affirmative because globalization sounds good in the textbook, but you're voting for the negative because protectionism works in the real world, and you can see this through multiple case studies that the affirm or that the negative is going to cite within this case. So let's get into some of the real impacts of protectionism and on the economic scale, right? So the heart of this case is economic potential, right? We're going to argue or deconstruct the myth that free trade is the only way that we can grow. So we'll start with like the history of the ladder, the development ladder that countries take. So the affirmative will tell you that South Korea, Taiwan are kind of globalization success stories. But this piece of Hagen 2024 evidence kind of flips the script on that. It proves that while these countries, exported, they also use covert protectionism. They use special taxes on luxury imports and approval mechanisms for domestic suppliers to build those industries and kind of get them ready for the aspects of globalization. Even the United States used some of the highest tariffs in modern history in the 1800s to become a superpower. And the impact here is kind of economic sovereignty. History shows that no country becomes a giant by letting others, stomp on infant industries. It has to protect itself first. So the impact here is really going to be, infant industries not being able to get up off the ground because, globalization opens the floodgates up to mega corporations stomping them down and buying them out instead of protectionist measures in order to build those industries up so they can become resilient to those things, right? Then we can also get into some other, case studies. Specifically, we can look at case studies such as NAFTA, right? As some of this, like the Shufton and O3 evidence sites, um, that NAFTA is kind of like an economic hemorrhage, and the developing countries kind of lose money up to $500 billion annually under globalization, far more than they receive in aid. We can use Mexico and NAFTA as the primary example, as the public citizen evidence and the widespread evidence show a devastating reality when it actually comes to globalization in some of these developing nations, right? So Mexico's poverty rate in 2012 basically identical to what it was in 1994 after it opened its floodgates to globalization. Uh, Real wages barely moved in the 20 years since NAFTA, was formulated, and in addition, 4.9 million farmers were displaced by subsidized U.S. corn, leading to mass migration, fueling of organized crime. That's driving immigration crises in the United States, and the impact becomes food dependency as well because Mexico now is having to import 45% of its food, which isn't development. It's a routine of dependency, as the KR and 13 evidence explains. It leaves nations vulnerable to the whims of corporations and organizations like the IMF, because once you join these globalized trade policies, you're opening the floodgates to governments like the United States subsidizing industries to take over the Mexican food industry, which forces the United States to become, the supplier of food to Mexico, now importing 45% of its food due to the fact that it opened its industries up to globalization well before it was able to maintain a resiliency that can be produced by protectionism first. So let's look at the actual solvency of protectionism itself, right? How does protectionism help build up the economies of developing nations, right? So the negative can solve this issue by through a wide range of policy that only protectionism can provide for, right? First, leveling the playing field. Hahn in 2024 argues that the current global market is not level at all. It favors wealthy nations, it favors multinational corporations. Protectionism acts as its shield. It allows domestic firms kind of the space to grow until they can actually compete. It allows them to maintain, a good market share in their current country before they're open to competing with multinational corporations that might be able to buy them out of their industry. Second, we have strategic shielding. This is a good China example here, right? Because China never was not always the globalized China it is now, right? It didn't just open up. In the 1990s and 2000s, they used protectionism to force multinational companies into joint ventures, right? This ensured technology transfer so that China could eventually produce the products themselves. It meant that these multinational corporations could not just come in and buy out Chinese industry. They had to have joint ventures with companies in China in order for these technological innovative transfers to take hold so that other foreign companies weren't able to just come in and take over Chinese markets. They had to integrate into Chinese markets because of the protectionist measures that the Chinese government issued through forcing these multinational corporations into joint ventures instead of allowing them to kind of take this economic adventurism as a sole mission. Third is going to be venture capital for nations. Think of state intervention like venture capital. Not every protected industry is going to succeed, but there are a few successful bets that can pay for all the failures and build a high income economy. If governments are able to subsidize their domestic industries, subsidize domestic economies, it can help build up high income situations so that when globalization takes hold, those corporations are not bought out by multinational corporations that are just preying on developing nations. So the negative kind of solves this by giving developing countries the same right to develop that the United States, United Kingdom, and China used themselves in order to get rich. So how do we win the development negative? You got to remember a couple of keys. First is the empirical hammer. When the affirmative talks about the theory of free trade, hit them with Mexico, hit them with China, that the most robust studies and 20-year case studies of globalization's failures in that developing nation and how countries like China were able to build up their nations and build up their industries first before opening themselves up to globalization, which is why developing nations should prioritize protectionism first over globalization. Second is the infant industry argument, explaining that you can't expect a local startup in Ghana to compete with a multi-billion-dollar corporation on day one. Protectionism is the incubator for developing countries and developing companies in those countries in order to, generate the high income revenue, the, positive economic cycles necessary to build the resilience before opening themselves up to multinational corporations. Third, it exposes the hemorrhage of globalization. Remind the judge $500 billion lost is lost globally because of globalized, free trade policies in developing nations, and how that money could have gone to schools, hospitals, infrastructure in those countries, but instead went to corporate profits because multinational corporations were buying out infant industries before, these developing countries could build up their resilience. The affirmative is asking for a world of free trade, but the negative proves that trade is never free for specifically developing nations, for specifically individuals in those developing nations that are currently in poor to middle income scenarios. It is necessary for their governments to protect them first, and then they can open themselves up to globalization, increase in innovative technologies, etc. But do so in a way that doesn't, murder their economies in the process and just open themselves up to multinational corporations. So next in the next video, we're going to get further into the negative side of things by focusing on the human rights aspect. Then we'll round out things with the last two negative videos as well.